We're Miami natives. I grew up 5 miles that way, and just in and around all of South Florida. I love for nature. Came from hiking in the Boy Scouts. My mom. I was in the Richmond Heights Zoo Magnet. The zoo was messed up after Andrew, so I'm actually coming here back on this parrot jungle for a while to learn about the animals and spend time there. Researching the ocean and bass, and I had this vivid vision of in high school this cross-section diagram with our Florida ecosystems, from marine and aquatic stuff, transitioning to the shoreline to low and highland hammocks to Pine Rockland. And when I moved back to Miami after some years abroad with my wife and kids, I wanted that in my backyard, which kind of started my whole awareness of native plants. So I did a big restoration in the back and in the front, and I kind of realized that everything is wrong. Like when you drive around, the things that people see, the plants that people know are, the things you learn from Home Depot are completely backwards. They don't support our ecosystems, and I'm really motivated to just about it. So I probably know less about plants than everyone here, but what I can bring to the table is big background in technology, digital marketing, work in robotics now, and I started, if you're familiar with Reforest Miami, the Instagram and website where I'm trying to raise awareness for native plants and bring the message here, which I'm so in admiration of, to my neighbors who have no idea and walk around with Roundup and the Buja and hopefully change their minds. So thanks very much for the opportunity, and appreciate you here.
Thank you very much, Marley. All right. Would anybody like to motion to accept the slate as proposed? All right, Ken Fairman. Any second? All right, John Rothschild. So we'll have discussion. If anyone has anything they'd like to say, questions, comments, concerns. All right, so all in favor of accepting the proposed slate, say aye. Aye. Any opposed, nay? And any abstentions? All right, so approved. Welcome to the board, Charlie. We're very happy to have you here. Exiting the board after many years of serving the chapter is Janine Feiger, a face that we all miss coming to the meetings. So I just wanted to take a quick moment to thank Janine for all her years of serving the board, and I very much hope that she continues to participate and come to the meetings so we can continue seeing her. So thank you very much, Janine. Hopefully you're tuning in on YouTube. Would anybody like to motion to close the annual meeting? Oh, Lydia? What's that?
Yes.
Oh, all right, Lydia, motion to close. Any seconds?
Second.
All right, meeting adjourned. Thank you, everybody. Now, let's get back to some usual business. Before our main program, as always, there's a few announcements to go through. First and foremost, I want to give a big thank you to Ken Fairman and also to Daniela Champney for coordinating last Saturday's yard visit. This is the first in a revival of a program that we used to offer. These were more regular yard visits to kind of give members different perspectives on native landscaping. So Ken, thank you for being the first in that kind of revival with it. And if you attended, I sadly wasn't able to, but if you attended, I hope you guys had a great time. On Tuesday, June 27th, we have our next monthly meeting here at Pinecrest Gardens. Details will be available soon on the chapter calendar, as well as the upcoming letter. So, oh, it's already there. I'm behind then. It's already there. You can get more details on it on the calendar. And then on Saturday, May 27th, so this coming Saturday, we have a field trip to Larry and Penny Thompson Pinelands led by Roger Hammer. Should be a lot of fun. Expect a lot of jokes. And that will run from 8:30 to 11:30. They've recently been conducting a few prescribed burns at Larry and Penny Park, so it's a great time to see some of these rare pine rockland plants that otherwise wouldn't be showing without the prescribed burn. That's it. Just wanted to be brief on those announcements. I'd like to welcome one new member, Charlene Regenhart. Is Charlene here present tonight? Well, she's joining from Key Largo, so that would be quite a drive to make it to this meeting. But Charlene, if you're tuning in on YouTube, welcome to the chapter. Thank you to everyone who donated plants. In the interest of time, we're not going to do the usual run through the raffle table, just because we have still quite a bit to cover with the usual presentation. But like always, after the presentation, there'll be a period of time to buy tickets, to look at the plans, and of course, feel free to ask questions. There should be a label with a description on most of the plans. Just a bit of housekeeping. Just please kindly turn off your cell phones or silence them. And if you'd like to learn more, please check out the newsletter and chapter calendar for more information, for more events, and for articles as well. All right, so let's get to the main program. All right, so tonight's presentation is by Tiffany Troxler. Come right up, here you go. I'll introduce you just kind of with the background. Yeah. One moment. All right. Tiffany is an associate professor in the Department of Earth and Environment and director of science in the Sea Level Solution Center in the Institute of Environment at Florida International University in Miami, Florida. She is an ecologist and sustainability scientist whose work cuts across science, policy, and management of natural and urban environments. She and her students examine how Everglades ecosystems respond to sea level rise and water management, and develop new research and tools to enhance their resilience to climate change. Her research group also advances interdisciplinary collaborative research that supports local to regional strategies and actions for climate change mitigation and adaptation. Tiffany, thank you very much for being here. Take it away.
Thank you. Oh, so this is just to record.
Yeah, that's just
Yeah.
for the audio.
All right. Can you guys hear me, or should I use the microphone? Okay, cool. Yeah, there you go.
Just bubble up this thing. All right, you're all set.
All right, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be invited to this chapter meeting. I don't think I'm currently a member, Patty, but I started with the Native Plant Society a very long time ago. I got so excited about native plants, going out on those walks and doing restoration projects at Cape Florida. So I'm very happy to be among people that love native plants. So hopefully I can get to be a member again and join you guys on one of the walks. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that we do at Florida International University in my research lab and with partners across Miami-Dade County and the South Florida region. So all of our work is around trying to understand how essentially the environment is no longer stationary, which means that what we knew to be our environment is changing every day. And it is in part because of climate change impacts. It's in part because of other human impacts that are converting our natural systems to urban systems, agricultural systems, and other types of systems. And trying to understand all of this to manage human and natural environments is challenging. And so we try to take into consideration that in order to understand how we can maintain and enhance sustainability of our human and natural environments, we need to consider the impacts of climate change. So I know all of you have heard about climate change, but I just like to show this one figure, which essentially illustrates the change in the concentration of CO2 in our atmosphere compared to a record that is 500,000 years before present. So that purple line there is showing sort of a stable cyclical pattern of carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere, and not until increasing, like dramatic increase in population and impacts of human activities have we seen a dramatic increase in carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. And every time it seems I show this slide to my students, I have to change the number of the CO2 concentration that has been recorded at the Mauna Loa station. It increases every year and will continue to increase with unabated carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions associated with fossil fuel combustion and lots of other human activities. Yeah. And so this graphic here is essentially showing the relationship between carbon dioxide concentrations in our atmosphere and the warming of our atmosphere. And this is a graphic that Jim Hansen puts out periodically, updating the community about observations recorded by numerous agencies, federal agencies. But essentially, that green line is illustrating the increasing hotness that it is each year, and it is related to the energy imbalance. So essentially, we have more energy coming into our atmosphere than is leaving, and the net balance of that is more warming in our atmosphere. And in fact, we've seen in the last 10 years some of the hottest temperatures on record. And that was actually with the impact, and more recently, the impact of La Nina, which would have made it a little cooler than it would have been otherwise. And now we're going into an El Nino cycle, and the UN is reporting that we're going to see some of the hottest temperatures that we've seen on record in the next 5 years. So it's getting hotter. And so we know that there are a number of impacts associated with this. One of those is sea level change. And this graphic here is showing what our 4 counties use as a planning tool to understand, based on what type of infrastructure they want to build and invest in, how resilient they should try to make that to flooding. So if you want to build a hospital and you want it to last for 100 years, you want to guide your planning using a higher sea level rise curve. So you can be sure that that hospital functions as it should for the amount of time that you intend it to. And so over here on the left, just showing some of the recorded sea level records or measurements from Key West and Miami Beach, showing about 9 to 10 inches of change in sea level over the last 100 years. But that has been increasing over the last 10 to 15 years, where the rate has gone up. And of course, those sea level rise projections are based on our level of ambition in terms of how and whether we reduce greenhouse gas emissions going into the atmosphere. So we know that these impacts are happening. We're seeing increasing heat, increasing sea levels. We're seeing incidents of rainfall events that are more intense storms. And this has impacts on both our human and natural environments. I'm showing a couple of pictures of both of those here. But some of the things that we record, for example, in the Everglades, are influence of saltwater intrusion in our drinking water supply. Rising groundwater table can impact the functioning of septic tanks in some areas that are low-lying. We see tidal flooding events. It's making it more difficult for us to manage our water on the landscape. So a number of things that we're observing related to changes in climate. And so what we know is that the way that we've designed and managed human and environmental systems in the past is simply not going to work for the future. And so what we need to do is think proactively and think forward about how we can redesign and conduct the science that we need to redesign, to inform that redesign of our natural and human environments. And in particular for our natural environments, for those environments to continue to provision ecosystem services that we depend on, like biodiversity or freshwater supply, or the the economy that comes from recreation and tourism. And so organizations working together, including local governments, are working to move the needle. So I'll just highlight two research projects that in coordination with many collaborators we're conducting to try to get a handle on some of these issues in South Florida. So I'll first talk about the Everglades. Whoops, sorry. First talk about the Everglades. So in working with a lot of graduate students as well as faculty and agency scientists at the National Park Service, South Florida Water Management District, Everglades Foundation, and in association with a program we have at FIU called the Florida Coastal Everglades LTER, we want to understand how saltwater intrusion and other types of impacts associated with water management may have an effect on our coastal marsh ecosystems. And so we conducted a number of, I'll just back it up first. So sort of the background for this. So for the Everglades, we know that there's a multi-billion-dollar Everglades restoration project going on, all with the intent of taking a system where a lot of the water is being shunted to the west and the east from Lake Okeechobee and put out to the canals along the southeastern coast and redirecting that water through Everglades National Park to have the effect of rehydrating wetlands, restoring fresh water recharge to our aquifer, and building resilience of our coastline so that we can have productive Everglades wetland ecosystem. So essentially trying to transform what you see on the left to what you see on the right, which is less water leaving Lake Okeechobee out the west and east, which we know has also resulted in some algal blooms up in those areas, having significant impacts on communities, and getting that water into Everglades National Park. But as all the while, we have sea level rise change that is happening that I mentioned earlier. And so these, the lack of freshwater flow and the increase of sea level increases salinity, which some of the plants that persist in the Everglades are very sensitive to salinity. So that's a stressor for our freshwater species like sawgrass, Cladium jimicensii. And so what we're trying to understand is whether these wetland species and in these peat marshes can withstand the influence of sea level rise over time. And so what we had done up into the time that this research began is that we weren't really thinking about the biology in respect to sea level change. So, you can look at these figures and you can say, okay, well, sea level is going to increase and that's going to flood everything. But what about the plants? How are they responding? Are they able to keep up with changes in sea level that help these wetlands to persist? But we didn't really know. So what are the drivers and how do those species respond to those drivers like salinity and inundation that is associated with sea level rise? So we began to study this phenomenon called which had been referred to as peat collapse. And so we know that in wetland environments, we have low oxygen in the soils, and the low oxygen promotes an environment where leaf material that's decaying and root material that's decaying is built up in the soils, and that forms the substrate by which these plants can persist, and the animals and the other species that persist in the Everglades. So this peat is essentially a building block of Everglades marshes. And so what we wanted to understand is if the plants that are forming this substrate are, their growth declines because we're having increasing salinity, is that going to influence the ability for those wetland species to produce that substrate that's essentially the building block of these coastal and freshwater marsh systems? And so this figure just illustrates what the implications of that is. So on the left-hand side, we have a plant species, sawgrass. It doesn't really look like sawgrass, but that's what it is. Sawgrass that's healthy and it's producing this peat material. And on the right, showing a collapsed situation where we've got less plant growth. And when we have less plant growth and more carbon dioxide coming out of the soils because the water level dries down, produces oxygenated situation that takes that organic carbon from soil and puts it out into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. Both of those things create a deficit, and then those peat soils can collapse. So this is the phenomenon that we intended to study. And we went out into the Everglades and we looked for conditions that may match this phenomenon of peat collapse. And in fact, just went out to the main park road, went just past, a little bit past Westlake, a little bit south of Westlake on the west side of Main Park Road, and found this condition where the sawgrass plants were essentially on pedestals. So there was illustrating that in that particular location, we were observing peat collapse just off the park road, which hadn't been observed before, and the park scientist at the time was pretty alarmed. And this is that location. So what you would see otherwise in a freshwater marsh is a homogeneous cover of plants there, no pockets, no pockmarks, so to speak. But this landscape pattern here, indicative of what we refer to as a collapsing marsh. And when you go out there and look at the salinity in the pore water is quite high, and has in fact increased over the time that we'd been conducting those experiments. So it's happening pretty fast. And so this is just a little conceptual diagram that illustrates some of the transformation of an unimpacted, intact freshwater sawgrass marsh to one that starts to collapse. So we did a bunch of experiments. We did experiments in outdoor mesocosms, and we did experiments in the field. And essentially, we added salt out in the field to try to replicate this increasing salinity impact. And then in outdoor mesocosms, we both lowered the water table within the mesocosm so we could create this sort of dry down condition, which was indicative of some of the hydrologic conditions in this particular peat marsh, and then also added salt so that we could see the combined effect of salinity and dry down on those peat marshes. And I don't know if you noticed, but you can't really see it here. But essentially our incubation buckets were Home Depot buckets that we put a bunch of holes in over there. And as you can see, the buckets lined up in these outdoor mesocosms with the sawgrass within those buckets that also had the peat along with it. So we took slugs of peat with a little bit of sawgrass in there to conduct this experiment. And we conducted actually a couple of different kinds of experiments to look at different salinity levels, to look at the combination of salinity and dry down, and then to look at the duration of dry down to see if the length of dry down had an effect on this phenomenon we call peat collapse, or producing it. And so I'll just draw your attention to one graph over here. So this is a bar plot that just shows the different levels of sawgrass growth. We call it annual net primary productivity. It's how we measure the growth of plants, or how we report the growth of plants. And so you see grams of dry weight per meter squared per year on that vertical axis. And on the horizontal axis, just showing the different treatments that we used. and the salt exposed. So we see, we've got the ambient submerged, which means it had no salt and it was inundated with water, as compared to ambient exposed. So without salt, you can expose those soils and the sawgrass productivity actually goes up. And then when you submerge those plants with salt and you submerge those plants and expose them to the air, you get lower growth of those sawgrass plants. So we're illustrating that salinity, as many of you probably know, that caladium doesn't like salt too much, but it's always been reported as sort of moderately salt tolerant. And these experiments help to illustrate exactly how salt tolerant they are. And then just one more set of graphs I'll show. So as I spoke about before, we're also trying to understand the combined effect of increasing salinity and this impact of hydrologic management. Sometimes we can't get enough fresh water down to those coastal marshes, and these peatland environments are sometimes in the dry season. The soils are exposed for up to 3 to 4 months, which is pretty long for a peat wetland. And so we wanted to try to simulate that effect in the experimental context. And so in these outdoor mesocosms, we gradually drew down the water level. That's what that blue line is, sort of a step function, drawing down the water level and then raising it back up. And elevation change you can see on the on that primary vertical axis there on the left, where we saw a pretty significant decline in elevation. So we actually simulated the effect of peat collapse in these outdoor mesocosms in response to a drawdown of the water level and salinity, which emulated what we observed in the field, which is a dry season. So that green line there is the soil surface. So this is the water table drawn down, which is similar to what we emulated in the field, that we emulated in our outdoor mesocosms. So then we're looking at this phenomenon of peat collapse from a plant soil interactions perspective at a plot scale. But we want to understand how what the implications of this are for coastal marsh vulnerability. And so another student is working on coupling remote sensing, so satellite data, to try to detect patterns in the landscape to determine whether some areas are more vulnerable to peat collapse because of increased salinity and because of dry season dry down, or not as vulnerable to those to peat collapse. And then essentially looking at it at multiple scales. So on the left here, he's combining salinity data, hydrology data, and observations of where peat is and where sawgrass is to indicate where on the landscape that coastal marsh may be vulnerable to peat collapse based on the experimental data that was derived. And then scaling that up to the region, you may recognize Whitewater Bay there and Cape Sable, and then trying to use that information to get a larger scale view of where sawgrass marshes are likely doing okay because they're not exposed to salinity, or not exposed to as high salinity or the dry down that I described, or those that are more vulnerable and potentially vulnerable to collapse. And so this is the large group of collaborators that have been working to try to understand this phenomenon. And so in terms of how Everglades restoration and the process of Everglades restoration is taking this work into consideration, essentially sea level rise wasn't being considered as part of the comprehensive Everglades restoration plan. And the National Academy's CISRIP committee took this information and really put it forward as something that the agencies needed to be taking into stronger consideration in terms of the restoration, the hydrologic management actions that could be necessary in order to support the persistence and sustainability of coastal Everglades marshes. Okay, so I'm going to just switch gears a little bit about how this type of work and work on coastal wetlands is lending to information to help us understand how these natural systems can contribute to greenhouse gas mitigation. So I talked about how these wetland environments, they essentially, those plants are sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and they're putting it below ground in this substrate that we talk about, that's peat, and how the increasing the area and the health of these systems can help to draw more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which we refer to as climate mitigation. And then also some local opportunities for how we can work these types of, or we can work wetland and coastal environments into urban environments to try to support climate adaptation. And this is how we're trying to minimize the impacts of climate change on our communities. So coastal ecosystems, naturally adaptive. This is showing a tidal marsh. We don't have tidal marshes down here really. You know, maybe not really. Our tidal environments are more, you know, mangrove over in the southwest coast. But we have extraordinary seagrass meadows, both in Florida Bay and Biscayne Bay, and lots of mangroves in the Everglades. And these systems are naturally adaptive, meaning that they change with sea level. They can grow with sea level, but after a certain threshold, they can also decline with an increase in sea level. And this figure here is just illustrating how these coastal environments produced a lot of this peat over time. We know the Everglades is about, what, 4,000 to 5,000 years old, and the Everglades was able to form those expansive peatlands because the sea level change was just right. And this was something that happened, you know, essentially across the world. We had extensive increase of these peatland and coastal wetland environments across the world. This is just showing the tidal marshes, but the early research was, people were really excited about these mangroves and how much carbon they could put below ground when they started to look at the carbon stocks. So they're looking at the, assessing the carbon above ground, getting that gram dry weight and multiplying that by the carbon content and understanding what the carbon is above ground, and then also estimating the carbon, like the peat that I talked about, below ground. And one paper illustrating, showing that, based on a synthesis, well, these mangroves are putting more carbon below ground than tropical forests. So that got people really excited about coastal wetlands as another type of ecosystem that could help us to mitigate, it could help us to sequester carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere as a tool against, to address climate change. And what's really important to produce that peat are these roots, super dense roots that come from healthy plants. And those roots decay and form that organic matter, which is the peat that I talked about. And people are also really excited about thinking about coastal wetlands and the ecosystem services that they provide. We don't always really, necessarily quantify those services, or it's very difficult to do that. And we may not fully recognize those services, that we're getting those services every day that we live here in South Florida. But some of the ones that are often referred to are pollutant regulation. So having a role in sequestering nutrients before it gets to near shore or aquatic environments, the productive fisheries that come from estuarine and coastal environments, coastal protection. So we know that mangrove forests, depending on their health, their structure, can reduce wave action, which can reduce the impacts of damages that can otherwise occur coming from coastal storms. And then, of course, recreation and tourism. So people are excited about all the carbon these things are sequestering. They're excited about all the coastal, all the ecosystem services that they provision. But with eyes wide open, understanding that depending on how these systems are managed, they can be vulnerable to things like peak collapse as sea level increases. And it's largely associated with how we manage those systems through, or also extreme storms can have an influence on those systems. But that's a whole other body of literature that is really exciting also. But in any case, the story here is these systems can adapt to sea level rise, changing sea level rise. It just depends on how they're managed. And so the IPCC got a hold of this. They were like, oh, wow, we're doing these greenhouse gas inventories, and there are these developing countries that have so many mangroves, and they could really benefit from incorporating or estimating the carbon dioxide that's being sequestered by these types of environments and put that into their national greenhouse gas inventories to try to, as a mechanism to promote the conservation and restoration of these systems, understanding that they produce all these services, but also have a climate change mitigation, a role in climate change mitigation. And so about 2010, the IPCC took on this issue. How can we incorporate and promote the restoration and management of coastal wetlands as a tool for mitigating climate change? This then launched into a bunch of other work where the EPA, DOE, national academies, we wrote a book on it, all really, trying to understand the best available science to understand how these systems can be used as a climate mitigation tool. And that work continues. And so now what we're trying to do is bring those concepts back down to the local level. So how can we use all of this science that we know about, with the rigor of the work that many people are doing in the Everglades, with the rigor of the work that's happening on the national and global scene in terms of understanding the science of coastal ecosystems, and bring those benefits back into our urban environment, understanding that, a place like Biscayne Bay used to have a lot of natural systems along the shorelines in our, within our terrestrial environments. So how can we bring those services back into the urban environment at the local scale? And so one sort of narrative around that is thinking, okay, well, if we want to, let's say, provide some kind of an infrastructure service, let's say we want to manage stormwater on the streets, we could generate a project that is intended and is designed to only manage stormwater on the streets, or we could bring some green features. We could bring some of those wetland features into the urban environment and generate multiple benefits from those projects. And so that's what these two graphics are intended to illustrate. So why not, bring some of these environments, bring some of these features back into the urban environment so that we can not only manage stormwater, but we can also regulate water quality. We can bring more aesthetic value into the urban environment. We can sequester carbon. We can increase habitat and diversity, among others. And cities are thinking about this. So these are a couple of older, renderings, but there's a lot of work going on to try to understand how we can bring more of those wetland and natural features back into our urban communities. And it starts with the design, it starts with the visioning, it starts with the discussions about, well, how could this be, and what would it be, and what would it look like, and would I like it? So this was one example on the left of the There was a resilient redesign program. And then over here, Miami Beach, sorry, you can't see it, but they have a Blue Ways master plan that's intentionally focused around bringing people more access to the water, more access to the environment, and trying to reintegrate those ecosystem services that have been lost from our urban environment. But what's really important is that the science is a little behind. We don't have as great of rigor of understanding whether, if we bring these systems back into the urban environment, are we going to get the benefits that we intend? And so that's where the science comes in. This is just an example of one student. There are lots of students doing work on this at multiple institutions, just trying to understand if we do restore mangroves in parks around Biscayne Bay, are we going to get the same level of carbon sequestration that we had before that system was removed, or removed from the environment? And these graphics, over here, this is showing sort of the reference condition of nitrogen storage, and this is showing the reference condition of carbon storage, showing a trajectory toward a reference condition, suggesting that yes, if these guys are able to grow and they're managed well for 20 years or more, we can regain some of those services that we used to have around Biscayne Bay in the mangrove wetlands that used to persist there. And then there are some designers that are doing really innovative things, trying to bring mangrove environments back into, very sort of gray type of conditions, along seawalls and things. These are a little bit harder to study, but it's really an emerging field. And it's exciting to see new opportunities for bringing these types of benefits and services back into our urban environment. Yep, so that's all I had. Thank you so much.
Well, we can keep the share on so we can.
Oops, sorry.
Well, they can still get the audience. Anybody have any questions? Can you describe the composition of peat? What's the actual mechanism for the peat breakdown?
Yeah, sure. So the peat is it's decayed leaf and root material. So the stuff, photosynthesizes, sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere, growing, it's got the green material. And then, over time, those leaves senesce and die, the roots leaves die and senesce, and that material is buried in place. And it's a very slow rate of burial, but over, thousands of years, it can build up to very large deposits. And so for the mechanism of salinity, so we see the largest impact on the peats from drying down the soils. So, the carbon accumulates there under conditions that are where oxygen is very low. And when you introduce oxygen to, an organic molecule or an organic particle, the microbial community gets really excited and they start chomping it and then releasing through the process of respiration, releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So the breakdown of the peat is more prominent with the exposure of those soils to the atmosphere and the oxygen that kicks up the microbes that start chewing that stuff, chewing it up and for their growth. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I was wondering, in the aerial view of the freshwater sawgrass marsh,
Yeah,
shows some of the signs of that peat collapse.
mm-hmm.
You would expect if it's coming from salinity of the groundwater that it would all start disappearing uniformly, but it kind of looks more like a function of that. Is there a reason why that happens that way?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's so the substrate below the peat in that area, we do have some mineral deposits, so some, mineral sediments down there. It's not exactly understood how it could be related to the, the variability, just the natural variability in the landscape. But, just as let's say you're at the top of the soil profile, just going down 5, 10, 20, 30 centimeters, the salinity continues to increase. So, so that could, potentially contribute to a situation where, you have higher salinity in some locations and lower salinity in other locations, just because of the variation in the peat topography. But yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and one that my students really interested in trying to figure out. Yes.
Red mangroves are a very unusual tree species that they die very, very easily. That storm killed red mangroves
Yeah.
en masse.
Yeah.
They represent a huge sequester of carbon. What happens to that carbon? From your perspective, or do you have one? Do you know enough about it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there have been a couple of storms, Irma, Wilma, so we have a long-term ecological research program that allows us to go out into the field and regularly monitor the same sites over time. And some of those sites are mangrove sites. And one of the patterns that was observed after Wilma and Irma is that in some locations, those mangroves rebounded pretty well. And then in other locations, they did not rebound very well. And you can actually see evidence of this. You drive down, US 1, and you can see areas where those mangroves are not rebounding. There's actually an area off of Main Park Road where it's also right before you get to Flamingo, where those mangroves are not rebounding. But that has been attributed to phosphorus subsidy from the sediments that are coming from the storm surge. So the wind is taking down the trees, but this phosphorus subsidy then helps the trees to regrow, the ones that are still persisting, and then those that are then also, they're there, they were, beat up by the winds, but still alive. And so in certain conditions, the mangroves do have the capacity to recover. Yeah, but what happens to the carbon? That's a great question. If those trees are lost, and there's, a large tidal range, that carbon can be lost to the to the aquatic system. Yeah. And I have another student who's trying to look at that in the marsh environment. What is the fate of that carbon that is vulnerable to collapse? Yeah.
We were talking here part about how coastal wetlands, they have the ability to kind of accumulate and growing up to a certain type of threshold.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you mentioned that certain kind of management practices can help.
Yeah.
Public reset.
Yeah. Yeah, great question. Yeah, so I mean, one of the big ones that we understand for the Everglades is restoring hydrology. So restoring connectivity. Some of these systems, if they are not being refreshed with fresh water, salt can accumulate, and that can have that can be a big stressor for those systems if they're disturbed. So they have a less of an opportunity to recover from a disturbance like a storm. So reconnecting fresh water. Also, yeah, I mean, we're still trying to understand whether certain fire management practices are not allowing those some of those areas to recover because they're exposed to salt. But that is, something just that needs to be, needs a little more research to understand that. Yeah, so those are some of the things. Yeah, removing roads. That's related to restoring fresh water, but allowing, removing hard infrastructure so that those wetlands can continue to migrate inland as another mechanism. Yeah.
And the natural accumulation rate of these peat beds been measured, and it's different. And the reason why I ask is because if we see a significant amount of peat loss,
Yeah.
what's the implication for restoration? How long would it take to get it back?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, so we do measure soil elevation change at a number of these sites. And one of those is in that area that I showed you with the pockmarks. And that site is indicating, which is what we would expect, the elevation is dropping. And there, it's a benchmark, and you have, it has an arm and it has pins, and you drop the pins and it allows you to get the referenced elevation of the marsh using those multiple measurements. That's the means by which the soil elevation change is measured. And it, but it, it varies, as you can imagine, depending on the site. But one of the concerns about the collapsing peat is that it makes it difficult for mangroves to then recruit into those conditions because the water becomes too deep. And so, really the best defense is to keep it from happening in the first place. But there is a bit of work that, for example, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is supporting, which is called, thin layer placement. Taking sediments from another location and trying to bring them into a place where this elevation change is occurring to try to enable restoration activities to occur. But that's it's a pretty big intervention. So certainly better to try to prevent it from happening in the first place. But yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, Patty.
So you showed some small projects in the cities, which looked like they were working, so to say. But at the same time, is everything else that's going on in the city just going to overwhelm any small efforts that may work, but they're compared to all the rest of the pavement that's going on.
Yeah.
In charge.
Yeah.
Still have seem like those little projects are more demonstration than actually making progress.
Yeah. Well, so for the example from Miami-Dade's restoration project, so you guys know Gary Milano, like he was responsible for a lot of those restoration projects along, around Biscayne Bay of mangroves. And that's, much more than a demonstration program. There are hundreds of acres of mangroves that he was able to lead restoration of. But in the context of, bringing these smaller features back into the urban environment, at this point, it really is more demonstration. But at the same time, it's something that is gaining strong recognition, particularly from our county government, as one tool in the toolbox to try to address climate change impacts. And I'm, working closely with, county staff. I'm very optimistic about the work that they're trying to push forward. But, you really can think about it as, the aggregate of those small projects to create the larger impact, which, is really more representative of a landscape that's restored rather than, sites. And that would be what I would advocate for if I was in that position to just keep at it. Thanks, Patty.
Thank you again. So
Thanks,
much.
Ryan. Sure.
We'll get started setting some raffle tickets. I just want to give a thank you to everyone who brought plants to the raffle table. We have quite a diverse assemblage of plants today. So we'll tell them there may be 15, 20 minutes, and then we'll go to. Thank you very much.
Right. When, at the beginning of the meeting, when you said something was on the calendar, or what's on the calendar, and I said, well, yes, it was, I thought you were talking about June.
Oh,
That's what was it?
the next monthly meeting. That's information that will be on anyway. So much.
Sure.
You guys try to come, you have an honorarium for you.
Oh,
Check the skip sheet. Would you like to?
absolutely.
Oh, thank you so much. Very much appreciated. Yeah.